The photograph arrived at the Boston Archive of Historical Documents on a cold March morning in 2024, wrapped in brown paper and accompanied by a handwritten note that simply read, "Found this in grandmother's attic. Thought it might be of historical interest. Monsieur Harrington." The sender had included no return address, and attempts to contact them proved futile, leaving the archive staff with nothing but the image itself and the mystery of its origins. The photograph, measuring 8 by 10 inches and printed on the thick albumen paper characteristic of the late 19th century, showed a scene of apparent innocence and joy. Dated 1888, according to a faint inscription on the reverse, it captured approximately 20 children playing in what appeared to be the courtyard of an institutional building. The children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 14, were engaged in various activities. Some played with hoops and sticks, others sat in small groups engaged in conversation, and several were captured mid-run across the cobblestone yard. The building that served as the backdrop for this scene of childhood merriment was an imposing 3-story brick structure, its facade dominated by rows of tall windows that reflected the afternoon sunlight. Architectural details visible in the photograph suggested it had been constructed in the Gothic Revival style, popular for institutional buildings of the period. A sign mounted near the main entrance, though partially obscured by shadows, appeared to read, "St. Agatha's Home for Foundling Children," though the text was difficult to make out clearly in the original image. Dr. Elizabeth Thornfield, the archive's senior photographic conservator, was assigned to process the mysterious donation. With over 20 years of experience in historical document preservation, Dr. Thornfield had developed an almost intuitive ability to extract maximum information from damaged or faded photographs. Her work had helped solve several historical mysteries, including the identification of previously unknown Civil War battlefields and the documentation of immigrant communities that had left few other traces of their existence. The orphanage photograph initially struck Dr. Thornfield as a remarkably well-preserved example of institutional photography from the 1880s. Such images were often commissioned by orphanages and similar institutions to document their work and potentially attract donors or volunteers. The composition was carefully arranged to present the children as healthy, happy, and well cared for, which would have been an important message for an institution that relied on public support for its continued operation. The children themselves appeared to be dressed in the simple but clean clothing, typical of institutional wear from the period. The girls wore dark dresses with white aprons and caps, while the boys were dressed in knickers and simple shirts. Their faces, though small in the original photograph, showed expressions of genuine joy and animation. Several children were caught in mid-laugh, others wore broad smiles, and even those engaged in quieter activities showed signs of contentment and security. Dr. Thornfield began her standard preservation process by creating high-resolution digital scans of both the front and back of the photograph. The reverse side revealed additional information that had not been immediately apparent. Along with the 1888 date, there was a photographer's stamp reading H. Whitman, Photographer, Boston, and what appeared to be a partial address. There were also several small notations in pencil, including a series of numbers that might have been inventory codes, and the letters SA, which likely stood for St. Agatha's. The scanning process itself revealed the remarkable quality of the original photograph. Despite being over 135 years old, the image showed minimal fading or damage. The detail captured by the photographer was extraordinary, allowing Dr. Thornfield to make out individual facial expressions, the textures of clothing and building materials, and even small objects scattered around the courtyard. This level of preservation was unusual for photographs of this age, suggesting that it had been stored under ideal conditions for most of its existence. As Dr. Thornfield worked to create the highest possible quality digital reproduction, she employed techniques that went far beyond simple scanning. Using specialized software originally developed for satellite image analysis, she was able to enhance contrast, reduce grain, and reveal details that would have been impossible to see with the naked eye. It was during this enhancement process that she first noticed something that would haunt her for months to come. In the upper left corner of the photograph, barely visible even under magnification, was what appeared to be a second-floor window of the orphanage building. At first glance, the window seemed empty, showing only the darkness of the interior room beyond, but as Dr. Thornfield applied increasingly sophisticated enhancement algorithms, She began to make out shapes within that darkness that defied easy explanation. Using a technique called edge detection, which highlighted sudden changes in contrast and coloration, Dr. Thornfield was able to isolate and examine the window area in unprecedented detail. What she discovered challenged her understanding of what she was looking at and raised disturbing questions about what had truly been captured in that seemingly innocent photograph of playing children. There, gripping the windowsill with what appeared to be desperate intensity, was a pale, emaciated hand. The fingers were unnaturally long and thin, with what looked like bones clearly visible beneath translucent skin. The hand appeared to be that of a child, based on its size relative to the window frame, but it showed signs of severe malnutrition or illness that gave it an almost skeletal appearance. Most disturbing was the positioning of the hand. It was pressed against the glass with such force that the fingertips appeared white from the pressure, as if the owner was desperately trying to break through the window to reach the courtyard below. The angle of the hand and the shadows it cast suggested that the rest of the figure was pressed up against the window, though the body itself remained hidden in the darkness of the room. Dr. Thornfield's initial reaction was professional skepticism. She had seen countless examples of photographic anomalies that appeared supernatural or disturbing, but had perfectly rational explanations. Shadows, reflections, and chemical artifacts could create the illusion of faces, figures, or other mysterious presences in historical photographs. She began a systematic analysis to determine whether the hand she was seeing was real or simply a trick of light and shadow. Her first step was to examine the window area under different types of spectral analysis. If the hand was a photographic artifact, it would show different characteristics under infrared or ultraviolet enhancement than if it represented an actual physical presence. What she found was that the hand showed all the characteristics of a real object. It cast appropriate shadows, reflected light in a manner consistent with human skin, and showed the kind of three-dimensional depth that would be impossible to fake with the photographic technology available in 1888. Chemical analysis of the photographic emulsion in the window area revealed no signs of damage or contamination that might have created the illusion of the hand. The silver compounds that formed the image were distributed in patterns consistent with the documentation of actual light and shadow, not the random clustering that would indicate chemical artifacts or damage. Most convincing of all was the discovery that the hand cast a shadow that fell across other elements visible through the window. This shadow was subtle but detectable under extreme magnification, and its angle and intensity were perfectly consistent with the lighting conditions present when the photograph was taken. Such detail would have been impossible to create artificially using the photographic techniques available in the 19th century. As Dr. Thornfield continued her analysis, she became increasingly convinced that she was looking at photographic evidence of a child who had been present in the orphanage building when the picture was taken, but who had not been allowed to join the other children in their play. The hand's desperate grip on the windowsill suggested someone trying to get attention to be included in the happy scene unfolding in the courtyard below. This discovery prompted Dr. Thornfield to research the history of St. Agatha's home for foundling children. Using genealogical databases, city records, and historical archives, she began to piece together the story of the institution and the children who had lived there during the 1880s. What she uncovered was a tale of tragedy and neglect that cast the cheerful courtyard scene in an entirely different light. St. Agatha's had been founded in 1872 by the Sisters of Mercy as a home for orphaned and abandoned children. The institution was designed to house up to 60 children at any given time, providing them with basic education, religious instruction, and preparation for eventual placement with adoptive families or entry into domestic service. For its first decade of operation, St. Agatha's had maintained a reputation as one of the more progressive and well-managed orphanages in the Boston area. However, records from the late 1880s revealed a disturbing pattern of financial difficulties and management problems. The original Mother Superior, Sister Catherine Brennan, had been replaced in 1885 amid allegations of financial impropriety. Her successor, Sister Margaret Donovan, had implemented a series of cost-cutting measures that significantly reduced the quality of care provided to the children. Most troubling were the changes in the institution's medical practices. Previously, Children who became ill were treated by a qualified physician and, if necessary, sent to local hospitals for specialized care. Under Sister Donovan's administration, sick children were instead isolated in a specially designated ward on the second floor of the main building, where they were cared for only by the sisters themselves, most of whom lacked any formal medical training. Dr. Thornfield found references to this isolation ward in several contemporary documents, including inspection reports from the city's Board of Health. The 1887 report noted that conditions in the upper floor sick room are of concern and recommended that children showing signs of communicable illness be immediately transferred to qualified medical facilities. There was no record of these recommendations being implemented. More disturbing still were the mortality records for St. Agatha's during the period surrounding the photograph. While the orphanage had previously maintained mortality rates comparable to other similar institutions, deaths among the children increased dramatically in 1887 and 1888. The official cause of death in most cases was listed simply as fever or consumption, but the sheer number of deaths, nearly 24 children in the span of 18 months, suggested either an epidemic or systematic neglect. What made these statistics even more troubling was the discovery that many of the children who died during this period had no record of burial in any of the city's cemeteries. Official records showed that the bodies had been claimed for burial by the institution, but there was no documentation of where or how these burials had taken place. This was highly unusual, as even pauper burials were typically documented with at least basic information about the location and date of interment. As Dr. Thornfield delved deeper into the orphanage's records, she began to develop a theory about what had truly been captured in the 1888 photograph. The children playing happily in the courtyard represented the healthy population of the institution, those who were well enough to participate in normal activities and who could be displayed to visitors or potential donors as evidence of the orphanage's success. But the pale, skeletal hand gripping the second-floor window told a different story. It belonged to one of the children who had been confined to the isolation ward, forgotten and neglected, while their healthier peers played below. The desperate grip on the windowsill spoke of a child who had been denied even the simple comfort of fresh air and sunshine, reduced to pressing their face against the glass to watch the life and joy they were forbidden to share. This theory was supported by additional details that Dr. Thornfield discovered through careful analysis of other areas of the photograph. Using the same enhancement techniques that had revealed the hand in the window, she found evidence of other faces pressed against second-floor windows, shadowy, indistinct shapes that only became visible under extreme magnification, but which consistently showed the characteristics of emaciated, desperate children. Most heartbreaking was a window near the center of the building, where enhancement revealed what appeared to be multiple small hands pressed against the glass. The positioning suggested several children crowded together at a single window, all straining to see the courtyard below. The pale skeletal appearance of these hands matched that of the first discovery, indicating that multiple children were being held in conditions that had reduced them to near starvation. Dr. Thornfield's research into the fate of St. Agatha's orphanage revealed that the institution had closed abruptly in late 1888, just months after the photograph was taken. Official records stated that the closure was due to financial difficulties and changing social needs. But contemporary newspaper accounts hinted at more troubling reasons for the sudden shutdown. A brief article in the Boston Herald, dated November 15, 1888, reported that city health inspectors had conducted an emergency investigation of St. Agatha's following anonymous reports of unsanitary conditions and neglect of children in the institution's care. The article noted that several children had been found in conditions of extreme ill health and had been immediately transferred to city hospitals for treatment. More damning was a follow-up article published 3 days later, which reported that investigators had discovered evidence of systematic neglect and possible abuse in the orphanage's isolation ward. The article mentioned that several rooms on the upper floor showed signs of prolonged occupancy by children who appeared to have been denied adequate food, medical care, and basic sanitation. However, the article also noted that by the time of the investigation, many of the children who should have been present in the ward were missing, with no adequate explanation provided by the institution's staff. The final article in the series, published on November 22nd, reported that St. Agatha's home for Foundling Children had been permanently closed and that the building would be sold to pay outstanding debts. Sister Margaret Donovan had disappeared, along with several other staff members, leaving no forwarding addresses. The surviving children had been transferred to other institutions around the city, though the exact number of survivors was never clearly documented. Most chilling was the article's final paragraph, which mentioned that workmen cleaning out the abandoned building had discovered evidence of unauthorized burials in the basement of the institution. City officials had ordered a full excavation of the building's foundation, but the results of this investigation were never made public, and no further newspaper coverage of the discovery appeared in any Boston paper. Dr. Thornfield's attempts to locate the results of this investigation proved futile. Records that should have been preserved in city archives had mysteriously gone missing, and attempts to locate descendants of the investigating officials yielded no useful information. It seemed that someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure that the full truth about St. Agatha's orphanage would never come to light. As her research continued, Dr. Thornfield began to experience phenomena that extended beyond the purely academic realm. Working late nights in the archive, she found herself increasingly disturbed by the photograph, particularly by the window area where she had discovered the skeletal hand. Under certain lighting conditions, the hand seemed to move slightly, the fingers appearing to flex against the windowsill as if the child was still trying desperately to escape from their confinement. More unsettling were the sounds that Dr. Thornfield began to hear while working alone in the archive. Soft scratching noises, like fingernails against glass, would emanate from the area near her computer screen when she was examining the enhanced images of the orphanage windows. The sounds were subtle but persistent, occurring most frequently during the late evening hours when the building was otherwise silent. Dr. Thornfield also began to experience vivid dreams related to her research. In these dreams, she would find herself walking through the corridors of St. Agatha's orphanage as it had existed in 1888. The building was filled with the sounds of children, laughter and conversation from the lower floors, where the healthy children lived and played, but also weeping and weak cries for help from the upper floors, where the sick and forgotten children were confined. In her dreams, Dr. Thornfield would climb the stairs to the second floor, drawn by the sounds of distress despite her growing fear. The isolation ward was a nightmare of neglect and suffering. Small dark rooms filled with emaciated children who had been left to waste away without adequate food or medical care. The children in these dreams would reach out to her with skeletal hands, begging her to help them, to tell the world what had happened to them. Most disturbing was a recurring dream in which Dr. Thornfield found herself in the courtyard of the orphanage, watching the scene captured in the photograph unfold before her eyes. She could see the healthy children playing and laughing, but she was also acutely aware of the desperate faces pressed against the second-floor windows above. In the dream, she would try to call attention to the children in the windows, but her voice would make no sound, and the playing children would continue their games, oblivious to the suffering of their forgotten peers. As these experiences intensified, Dr. Thornfield began to suspect that her deep examination of the photograph was somehow creating a connection between herself and the tragic events it documented. The enhanced digital images seemed to serve as windows not just into the past, but into the actual experiences of the children who had suffered and died at St. Agatha's. This suspicion was reinforced when Dr. Thornfield discovered that the skeletal hand in the window was continuing to change in successive high-resolution scans. Using the same temporal comparison analysis techniques that had proven so revealing in other historical photograph studies, she found that the hand's position shifted slightly between scans taken days apart. The fingers would appear to move incrementally, sometimes gripping the windowsill more tightly, other times seeming to reach outward as if trying to break through the glass. Most chilling was the gradual emergence of additional details around the hand. As Dr. Thornfield continued her analysis, she began to make out portions of an arm, a shoulder, and eventually the suggestion of a face pressed close to the window. The face, when it finally became visible under maximum enhancement, was that of a child no more than 8 or 9 years old, with hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and an expression of desperate pleading that seemed to be directed specifically at whoever was examining the photograph. Dr. Thornfield realized that she was not simply studying a historical document, but was somehow participating in a supernatural phenomenon that allowed the suffering children of St. Agatha's to communicate across the barriers of time and death. The photograph was not merely preserving their images, but was serving as a conduit for their desperate need to have their stories told and their suffering acknowledged. This realization prompted Dr. Thornfield to expand her research beyond the orphanage itself to the broader context of child welfare in 19th century Boston. What she discovered was a systematic pattern of neglect and abuse that extended far beyond St. Agatha's. Dozens of institutions throughout the city had been operating with minimal oversight, often more concerned with maintaining their public image than with actually caring for the children in their charge. Records from other orphanages, foundling homes and charitable institutions revealed mortality rates that were consistently higher than the general population, along with frequent reports of malnutrition, disease, and suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths of children in institutional care. In many cases, the same pattern that had emerged at St. Agatha's was repeated. Healthy children were displayed to the public as evidence of institutional success, while sick, disabled, or simply inconvenient children were hidden away and left to suffer in isolation. Most disturbing was Dr. Thornfield's discovery that this pattern of institutional abuse had been an open secret among Boston's social reform community. Letters and diary entries from contemporary reformers showed that many were aware of the conditions in institutions like St. Agatha's, but were either powerless to intervene or were actively discouraged from investigating too closely by city officials who relied on these institutions to manage the city's population of unwanted children. One particularly revealing document was a letter written by Margaret Fuller, a prominent social reformer, to a colleague in 1887. In the letter, Fuller described visiting St. Agatha's and being given a tour that included only the show areas of the institution. She noted that she had heard sounds from other parts of the building that suggested the presence of many more children than were being displayed, and that her requests to see additional areas had been politely but firmly refused. Fuller's letter concluded with a chilling observation. "I fear that what we are being shown represents only a fraction of the children housed in this institution, and I shudder to think what conditions might exist in those areas that visitors are not permitted to see. These children are among society's most vulnerable, and I suspect they are being systematically abandoned to fates worse than death itself." As Dr. Thornfield's research progressed, the phenomena associated with the photograph became more intense and more personal. The scratching sounds she heard while working became louder and more persistent, sometimes lasting for hours at a time. The dreams expanded to include not just visits to the orphanage, but encounters with individual children who would tell her their names, describe their suffering, and beg her to ensure that their stories would not be forgotten. Most unsettling was her growing conviction that the children in her dreams were not simply products of her imagination, but were actual contact with the spirits of those who had died at St. Agatha's. The details they provided about their lives and deaths were consistently accurate when checked against historical records, and they often provided information that Dr. Thornfield had not yet discovered through her conventional research methods. One recurring figure in these dreams was a girl named Annie O'Malley, who appeared to be about 10 years old and claimed to have died in the isolation ward in early 1888, just months before the photograph was taken. Annie would describe the conditions in the ward in horrific detail: children left alone for days at a time, inadequate food and water, no medical care for those who became ill, and the gradual deterioration of children who had arrived healthy but had been condemned to the ward for minor infractions, or simply because they were inconvenient. According to Annie's account, the children in the isolation ward had been able to hear the sounds of their healthier peers playing in the courtyard below, but were never allowed to join in these activities. They would press themselves against the windows for hours at a time, watching the games and laughter that they were forbidden to share. The skeletal hand that Dr. Thornfield had discovered in the photograph belonged to Annie herself, captured in one of her desperate attempts to attract the attention of someone who might help her and her fellow prisoners. Annie's story was corroborated by other children who appeared in Dr. Thornfield's dreams, each providing details about their own experiences in the isolation ward. Thomas McCarthy, age 7, described being sent to the ward after becoming ill with what was probably influenza. then being left alone without food or water until he became too weak to call for help. Mary Flanagan, aged 12, had been confined to the ward after being accused of stealing bread from the kitchen, then forgotten until malnutrition and despair had reduced her to little more than a living skeleton. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the story told by little James Murphy, who had been only 5 years old when he died in the ward. James described being sent upstairs after crying for his mother, then being left in a small dark room where he waited day after day for someone to come and take him back to the other children. He had pressed his face against the window every day, watching the courtyard below and hoping that someone would notice him and remember that he was still there. These dream encounters provided Dr. Thornfield with names and stories that she was able to verify through orphanage records and death certificates. The children who contacted her had all died during the period leading up to the photograph, and their deaths had all been recorded with the vague, inadequate explanations that characterized the institution's record-keeping during its final months. As Dr. Thornfield continued to document these stories, she began to understand that she had been chosen by the children of St. Agatha's to serve as their voice, to ensure that their suffering would finally be acknowledged and their stories preserved for posterity. The photograph was not just historical evidence, but was a deliberate message from the past, designed to eventually reach someone who would have the tools and determination to reveal the truth. This realization led Dr. Thornfield to make a decision that would define the rest of her career. Rather than simply preserving the photograph as a curious historical artifact, she would dedicate herself to documenting the full story of St. Agatha's orphanage and ensuring that the children who had died there would finally receive the recognition and remembrance they deserved. Her first step was to create a comprehensive digital archive that included not only the enhanced photograph, but also all of the historical documents, records, and testimonies she had gathered during her research. She used advanced digital preservation techniques to ensure that the evidence would be available to future researchers, and included detailed documentation of her enhancement methods so that others could verify and expand upon her discoveries. Dr. Thornfield also reached out to local historians, genealogists, and descendants of families who had been connected to St. Agatha's, sharing her findings and encouraging others to contribute additional information about the orphanage and its residents. Slowly, a more complete picture of the institution began to emerge, revealing a tragedy of neglect and abandonment that had been hidden for over a century. Perhaps most importantly, Dr. Thornfield worked to identify as many of the orphanage's residents as possible, creating individual records for each child she could document and attempting to locate information about their families and origins. For many of the children who had died in the isolation ward, this research represented their first recognition as individuals rather than anonymous statistics in institutional records. The work was emotionally exhausting and often heartbreaking, but Dr. Thornfield found it deeply meaningful to give names and stories to children who had been forgotten by history. Each successful identification felt like a small victory against the forces that had tried to erase these young lives from memory. As her research became more widely known, Dr. Thornfield began to receive contacts from people whose families had been connected to St. Agatha's in various ways. Descendants of former residents, staff members, and even city officials provided additional documents, photographs, and family stories that helped to fill in gaps in the historical record. One particularly significant contact came from the great-granddaughter of H. Whitman, the photographer who had taken the original 1888 photograph. The woman had preserved several other photographs from the same session, including images that showed different angles of the orphanage building and closer views of individual children. These additional photographs provided crucial context for understanding the circumstances under which the original image had been created. Most revealing was a photograph that showed the interior of one of the second-floor rooms, apparently taken as part of the same documentation session that had produced the courtyard image. The interior photograph showed a bare institutional room with several small beds arranged along the walls. The beds appeared to be occupied, though the figures lying in them were so emaciated and still that it was difficult to determine whether they were alive or dead. The photographer's notes, preserved with the additional images, provided the final piece of the puzzle. According to these records, H. Whitman had been commissioned by the city's Board of Health to document conditions at St. Agatha's as part of their investigation into reports of neglect and abuse. The cheerful courtyard scene had been arranged by the orphanage staff to present the institution in the best possible light, while the photographer had also been secretly documenting the conditions in the isolation ward for the investigators. Whitman's notes indicated that he had been deeply disturbed by what he had witnessed during his visit to St. Agatha's. He described finding children in various stages of malnutrition and illness, many of whom appeared to have been neglected for weeks or months. The photographer had attempted to document these conditions as thoroughly as possible, but had been limited by the orphanage staff's attempts to control what he was allowed to photograph. The skeletal hand that Dr. Thornfield had discovered in the window represented one of Whitman's attempts to capture evidence of the hidden suffering within the institution. The child, whose hand was visible, had apparently been pressing against the window during the courtyard photography session, trying desperately to get the attention of the photographer or anyone else who might help. Whitman had noticed the figure in the window and had deliberately framed his shot to include this evidence of the conditions on the upper floors. Unfortunately, Whitman's photographs had not been sufficient to save the children of St. Agatha's. The city's investigation had been thorough, but had come too late for many of the institution's residents. By the time authorities had gained access to the isolation ward, numerous children had already died, and the survivors were in such poor condition that many did not recover despite receiving proper medical care. The closure of St. Agatha's had been presented to the public as a routine administrative matter, with no mention of the tragic circumstances that had actually prompted the shutdown. The children who had died in the isolation ward had been quietly buried in unmarked graves, their stories buried along with their bodies. Dr. Thornfield's research represented the first attempt in over a century to document and memorialize the true history of St. Agatha's orphanage. Through her work, the children who had died, forgotten and alone, were finally being recognized as individuals whose lives had meaning and whose suffering deserved to be acknowledged. The enhanced photograph that had started her investigation became the centerpiece of a traveling exhibition that Dr. Thornfield organized to share her findings with the public. The exhibition included not only the original image and its enhanced details, but also the additional photographs discovered in H. Whitman's archives, historical documents related to the orphanage, and profiles of individual children who had lived and died at St. Agatha's. The response to the exhibition was overwhelming, with visitors often moved to tears by the stories of the forgotten children and the evidence of their suffering. Many commented on the power of the skeletal hand in the window, noting how this single detail transformed their understanding of what appeared to be an innocent historical photograph. Perhaps most gratifying for Dr. Thornfield were the responses from people who had been adopted from orphanages or who had family connections to similar institutions. Many shared their own stories of family members who had lived in orphanages during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, contributing to a broader understanding of the experiences of institutionalized children during this period. The exhibition also prompted additional research into other orphanages and charitable institutions from the same era, with historians and genealogists using Dr. Thornfield's methods to examine photographs and documents from other institutions. This expanded research revealed that the pattern of neglect and abuse documented at St. Agatha's had been widespread, affecting thousands of children across the United States and other countries. Dr. Thornfield's work ultimately led to changes in how historical archives approached the preservation and interpretation of institutional photographs. Her techniques for digital enhancement and analysis were adopted by archives and museums around the world, and her research methods became a model for investigating historical cases of institutional abuse and neglect. Most importantly, the children of St. Agatha's orphanage were finally given the recognition and remembrance they deserved. Through Dr. Thornfield's research and the stories shared in her exhibition, these forgotten victims of institutional neglect were restored to their rightful place in history, their suffering acknowledged, and their humanity affirmed. The 1888 photograph continues to serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of looking beneath the surface of historical documents and questioning the stories that institutions tell about themselves. The skeletal hand gripping the windowsill stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the desperate desire of the powerless to be seen, heard, and remembered. In death, the children of St. Agatha's had finally found their voice through the dedication of a researcher who was willing to look closely enough to see what others had missed. Their story serves as both a memorial to their suffering and a warning about the dangers of allowing society's most vulnerable members to be hidden away and forgotten. The pale, desperate hand in the window will forever remind us that behind every institutional facade, behind every carefully arranged public image, there may be hidden truths waiting to be discovered by those with the courage and compassion to search for them. The children of St. Agatha's waited over a century for someone to notice their silent plea for help, but in the end, their patience was rewarded and their stories were finally told.